I am thrilled to have Dred Scott here today because one of the earliest artworks I remember that really got my attention, and I'm not talking about going to MoMA when I was in kindergarten, but as an adult hearing it, was Dred Scott's piece, How to Salute the American Flag. Is that the time?
It's what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag?
What is the proper way to display the U.S. flag? In which he laid an American flag across the floor and put a pedestal at one end with a book where you could enter comments. But the only way to get to that pedestal was to walk across the American flag. I thought this was a great idea, but George W. S.W.
Walker, H.W.
H.W. did not, H.W. Bush did not agree with this at all and lambasted Dred Scott in the news. And it was a time when the only artists I appreciated were ones that were getting attention because Republican politicians were criticizing them. That was more important critique to me than what they got from art critics. Anyway, today we have Dred Scott, who has a number of things to discuss with us. And Anne, would you like to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say thank you, Dred, for being in our show and also joining us today in a conversation with some of our Art at a Time Like This community. So we wanted to ask you first, how do you balance creativity and social issues in your work?
Well, I mean, first off, thanks for having me on. I think it's really great to be part of this conversation and, connected to this show. As far as that balance, I mean, I think that all art, is political. And the question is, are you explicit about that? And what are your politics and how does that come through in the art? And for me, the world is profoundly unjust. There's a tiny handful of people that controls the great wealth and the knowledge that humanity as a whole has created. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's causing tremendous suffering. And so, the work that I make tends to look at this, both to encourage an audience to confront and re-examine a lot of the cohering ideals of American society, but often to imagine how the world could be radically different and far better. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only way I engage the world. And so I am also an activist and do things that way. And there is a life-art balance, but there is... I'm hearing a Dieter A that is kind of...
I just muted. Muted.
Good. And so, there are things beyond sort of making that through into the art. But the thing is, it's like, artists have disproportionate influence in society. And we happen to be part of the section of society that has the relative luxury to work with our heads. Most people on the planet don't do that. And for those of us that do and then communicate ideas, it really matters what those ideas are and what we say. And so I try to use the time that I can to talk about some big questions. And so I guess the balance is that everything I do is about sort of engaging the world and trying to sort of enable people to see how we could get to a world that is not scarred by profound exploitation and oppression.
It's very interesting. These kind of questions come up around artists like Ai Weiwei, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is he an activist or is he an artist? Whereas you don't see a division between those things, and you see it as being a citizen, probably, and making art as a citizen. But I was curious about if you would talk a little about the Slave Rebellion performance you did in New Orleans last year.
Yeah.
Do you want that to be perceived as a protest or as a work of art?
Well, I mean, I do actually see that there's a difference between art and protests. I mean, in very broad brushstrokes, I think the difference of when I'm doing just regular activism, often there's a particular demand that were trying to get met, like, free so-and-so from jail or stop polluting X thing. With art, it's more talking about the ideas that sometimes are more long lasting, not always. But and so with something like Slave Rebellion Reenactment, which was a project that reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the history of the United States, a rebellion that happened in 1811 outside of New Orleans, we had 350 people in period costumes from the 19th century with machetes and muskets and sickles and sabers. We chanted, "On to New Orleans, freedom or death, we're going to end slavery, join us," for the course of 2 days, covering 26 miles. It was a performance that was in public. It wasn't in an indoor space. It was throughout the outskirts of New Orleans, and then started in St. John the Baptist Parish. And, if we were just doing a protest, we would not have spent all the effort and attention to get the period costume and people move as an army. We wouldn't have made flags that were the flags that people might have carried in 1811. This was an artwork, and it was with the scale and budget of an independent film, and it was beautiful and amazing to see, even if for some people challenging and for other people totally inspiring. And it's not that protests can't be that, but this was not that. I have been to protests, and I've organized and led some of them. And even though there were some signs as part of that, the signs were flags. I mean, this was not. This was a beautiful aesthetic thing where we practiced and rehearsed, and actually it was a conceptual, community engaged artwork. That's what it was, and that's how I hope it's written about. I mean, in some places it is written about that way in both mainstream newspapers like The Guardian and the New York Times, but also there's I've been articles in some art publications as well, and hopefully they'll address it both in terms of the politics and history behind it, but also the aesthetic questions, and draw comparisons to, say, Jeremy Deller's The Battle of Orgreave, or some of the projects that happened in the early Soviet Union that, say, Sergei Eisenstein or others did, where they were mass spectacles, and as well as some sort of community engaged work that's happening today, work like Jefferson Pinder's work about the so-called race riots that happened during Red Summer. So yeah, I'm an artist.
Yes, I know you're an artist. Could you just talk a little bit about what the preparation was that went into pulling off that performance?
Well, the preparation was vast, and I mean, it's one of these things that, had I known in advance what I was getting myself into, I might have rethought it. I thought, oh yeah, this is easy. We just, in 3 years, we'll raise the money, we'll do this, and it actually turned out to be a 6-year project, and getting people to do it. It was complicated. I mean, I started, during the Obama administration, and then the open racism that is concentrated in the Trump administration was much more pervasive, and white supremacists were driving their cars into peaceful demonstrations of anti-racist protesters. And so it became more complicated, but the preparations were first actually trying to come up with the idea, and then really learn the history, to really think through what is this particular history and buried and suppressed history about the slave rebellion in 1811. And then to actually begin doing research into what would the costumes have looked like, and building out a team. I mean, I didn't do all this work myself. There was, costume designers, there were, stage managers, there were production project managers. There was a team at Antenna, which is a really great small art space in New Orleans that actually has really good ties with the community. We started to work with historians. We started to contact student organizations. And so it was really building people, and it was a community engaged project. One of the key links in the project was we worked with a who is an actress, but also has really great outgoing personality. And though she didn't know a lot of people in St. John the Baptist Parish, and specifically some of the towns in that parish where we wanted to go through, she was willing to go out and meet people. And so we ended up then meeting some of the pastors and civic leaders there, and having conversations with them about why they should participate in this. And questions very quickly came up that said, well, look, Tread, I really like this project. This is fantastic. This history is important to us, but you're from New York, and you're going to come here, and you'll probably leave at some point, whereas our church might get firebombed. This is a racist community. And, when you leave, people will, be upset with us and you, but they'll be able to get to us. And so we had really soul searching conversations about what's the continuum of the legacy of, say, the civil rights movement to an art project like this, and whether it was worth it for people to, say, become freedom riders at great personal risk, to end Jim Crow, and what are the similarities today that people should be fighting against and making art against. And so, there were churches that came out and various civic leaders and artists and activists. And so it was really, there were a long period of conversations with the community to get buy-in, including amongst people that didn't always work together and know each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you for going a little deeper into your last year's project. Earlier in our conversation, you kind of mentioned or briefly tapped on art being of small influence to our political or social issues. You said something about a smaller inch, but I'm interested to know if you think that raising awareness with these works is enough to set change in motion around these topics.
Well, yes, but I mean, it's like, how does change in big, complicated societies happen is sort of the question. And without, say, people, and again, we'll talk about the civil rights movement a bit, there were a lot of protests which people don't know anything about now. The Freedom Riders, when they got on those buses, which were buses that were trying to have the federal government enforce new legislation which said that buses could be integrated. And there was tremendous resistance to that in the South. And when Black and white kids sometimes from the North, sometimes from the South, got on buses, they were literally firebombed and people were beaten to within an inch of their life. Those people who got on those buses did not know that was going to happen, nor did they know that if it did, it would be a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. There were plenty of other things that happened in civil rights movement that we don't know. And I think that though that kind of change, there were a few incidents which led to big change and other incidents which were part of the zeitgeist and getting people to think about these questions in different ways. A minority of people, a handful of people had this radical idea that you could end legalized discrimination in the United States. In 1950, that was a controversial idea. By 1970, it was a widely accepted idea, even if there was a lot of resistance to it, even if it wasn't universally accepted. But it took 20 years for that change to happen. And I think with art, it's like we look back at a work, say like Guernica by Picasso, that actually told, the atrocities during the Spanish Civil War in a way that today we're still looking back at that. Or if you look at, say, a song by NWA, Fuck the Police, at the time that Black youth were being killed by the police, and they thought it might have just been the individual cop in their block that was messing with them, that then everybody suddenly got it, wait a minute, this is a much more widespread phenomenon across all of America. Where you look at a song by Jimi Hendrix where he played the national anthem the way he did at Woodstock, where millions of people suddenly were hearing the war and bombing and destruction through his guitar. And so I think artwork can actually both lift people's spirits and sustain them in dark times, but also get them to look at the world in new ways. And so with a project like Slave Rebellion Reenactment, before that project, most people were not thinking that much about enslavement, and far fewer were thinking about sort of telling that story from the perspective not only of the enslaved, but the enslaved who were trying to end slavery by overthrowing a system of enslavement, which actually, if you don't understand slavery, you can't understand the United States and actually much of the modern world. Because without slavery, you don't get France the way it is, you don't get Portugal the way it is, you don't get Italy the way it is, you don't get England the way it is, you don't get Spain the way it is, you don't get all of Europe the way it is, and you don't get America the way it is. So slavery is the foundation of modern society. But also, if you don't understand that, if you don't understand that all during that time, enslaved people were resisting. 10% of the transatlantic voyages which were carrying people that were enslaved, there were rebellions on 10% of those ships. If you don't know that, you might think, oh, Africans just willingly went along with that, which was not the case. There were over 250 documented examples of slave rebellions in the United States of 10 people or more. Again, if you don't know that, you might think that enslaved people went along with that. And that's even an issue and something that weighs down on particularly a lot of Black youth who think that their ancestors just willingly put up with this as opposed to resist it. It actually changes how people feel in their bones and they exist on a day-to-day basis. And so this project, well, a project by one artist and 350 collaborators plus a support staff, it's not going to change the world in instantly, but it actually did change the conversation. And for people that participated, some of the people that were part of it said it changed their lives, which most artists don't have people tell them that an artwork changed their lives. And then people who saw it, who weren't participants, they said it was one of the most beautiful things they've seen. Now, not everybody, it was not universally loved. I'm not saying that everybody that saw it thought it was the best project ever. It's not even a popularity contest, but it is something that for many, many people, hundreds of people, it was deeply transformative. And I know that some of the activists who were part of it, as well as some artists and others who were part of this that aren't activists but somewhat became activists through this, are some of the people fighting in the midst of the coronavirus crisis and the pandemic against some of the very toxic, polluting chemical plants in St. John the Baptist Parish, which has the highest concentration of death in the United States for COVID-19, and it's highly concentrated amongst Black people. And so some of the people who were participating in Slave Rebellion reenactment felt a stronger sense of possibility of change, thinking about change not for what they think is possible to change, but what they think is necessary to change, and then on that basis figuring out how to change things.
Yeah.
Well, you made that wonderful poster, a painting for us, Redistribute Health.
Yeah.
And it's been distributed everywhere. And
cool.
We were wondering when you made it and if you think it's particularly relevant now.
So that project is largely part of a bigger project called Statements, which was a set of letterpress prints that I started doing about a year and a half ago. And they're about 14 inches by 22 inches or something like that. And they are just text pieces on paper in a style of old soul band posters. And so the first one I think I did was Redistribute Wealth, and then possibly we have to do something to stop white on Black crime. And so it took sort of common statements and just put them on poster form. And then I did a couple of others. And then when this, crisis hit, I thought, oh, well, actually Redistribute Wealth is both something that's urgently needed, but also something that people kind of know. But the question about health is something that, what if we flip the popular saying and said, well, we need to redistribute health. And that was something that became very apparent early on. This is a virus. The virus doesn't care whether you're rich or poor, Black or white, whether you're born in Colombia or United States or France or China. That doesn't care about that. But the virus does not discriminate. It's not racist. But the societies that it exists in are racist. And so the fact that a place like La Place, New Orleans, which is in St. John the Baptist Parish, has this high death rate from coronavirus is completely because this is a society that is founded on racism and exploitation. And so, a question of Redistribute Health actually gets to both an urgent need to understand that the inequality in this society is measured on everything, including health, and that we actually need to change how health is distributed.
What do you think is the most important issue you're working on now with your work?
I don't know. I do think that the Slave Rebellion Reenactment Project is not sort of put on the shelf. There's a film that's being made about that. I'm collaborating with John Akamfra, who's an amazing filmmaker. He's a British Ghanaian filmmaker. And we're working on a film. The pandemic has actually slowed the timeline, so we don't actually know when it's going to happen. We thought it might come out, like sort of October of this year, but I don't think that's realistic at this point for a lot of complicated reasons. There's exhibitions that were going to happen that we're going to show some of the still photography in 40 by 60 size. So I'm still doing that. I was also working on a project called Vote in American Election, which was going to enable people around the world who are really affected by U.S. foreign policy to have a vote in the U.S. presidential election. Obviously, the votes wouldn't count, but I do think people, say in Afghanistan or Mexico or Iran or China, should have a say in what happens in the United States, and sort of posing that question, as well as for people who are legally disenfranchised, including a lot of imprisoned people and formerly incarcerated people. So I was doing that, and I think that's still really important in a new and different way now. I mean, when you have a man that's encouraging people to drink or inject bleach or stick light bulbs down their throats as a cure for COVID, I think I don't have a whole lot of faith in electoral politics, but my God, this regime needs to be driven from power as soon as possible. It is something that people should look at the recent examples from South Korea and Hong Kong and even in San Juan in Puerto Rico when the governor was driven from power. People should look at that here, and it's obviously more complicated in the midst of a pandemic of how to demonstrate to do that. But the current political leadership is literally killing people. It is literally causing death. If you're in prison, if you're in a detention center, or if you just happen to live in a city, say like New York, which has a raging coronavirus epidemic, and largely because there was not testing. When it's like in January, anybody with eyes could have seen, wait a minute, this is going to be a pandemic. The alarm bells were going off in China and then in Italy, and this country did absolutely nothing. And so the ambulance sirens that we're hearing daily, hourly, minute by minute in New York City are at the hands of this government that left people to suffer and die, and its lack of science and its desire to impose a much more sort of, frankly, anti-science, theocratic, fascist form of rule in this society. And it's unnecessary, and it's outmoded, and it is profoundly showing everything wrong with the society in a certain sense.
Right.
And so I'll tell one other artwork, just because this is about artwork, a bit of work that I haven't done that will probably be finished up in, I hope, a week or so, is a video that's a very simple video shot out of my back window that basically has nothing happening for most of the time other than birds fleeting through or something like that. But you hear the constant blaring of sirens because that's what's happening in New York right now.
Thank you. What do you think?
Hear out of my window, the sirens right now.
Yeah.
What do you think needs to happen right now, immediately during this crisis? What are the things that we need to focus on in our messaging?
Well, I mean, there is some messaging that's good that's been getting through. People should wash their hands. People should wear dust masks, not to protect themselves from the virus, but to protect others in case they don't know that they are in fact carrying. So if you go outdoors, you should cover your face. I mean, that's simple. But other things like, taking responsibility for humanity as a whole, as opposed to you as an individual, is something that would be, if people approach things like that, it would change a lot of things. And from that perspective, homeless people should be housed in all these vacant hotel rooms. That's very basic. People should be let out of prisons. Anybody who is a nonviolent offender, regardless of whether they had years left on their sentence or whether they have, just a couple days, whether they are young or old, whatever, the prison should be emptied, and the government should be helping. Prisons and jails should be emptied, and the government should be helping to house people. So if they have family to go back to, that's great. If they don't, they should be trying to find a place for them. It's both a thing that for the humanity of the people that are in prison, but also for the society as a whole, because one of the biggest hotspots of COVID right now in the country are Cook County Jail and a jail in Ohio. And the thing is, it's not just, again, the virus doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care whether you're a prisoner or a corrections officer or the family member of a correction officer or somebody else who just happened to be, giving a haircut to the family member of a correction officer. As long as there is COVID anywhere, it's going to poison the planet as a whole. And so, we need to actually really look at where there are concentrations of people who cannot socially isolate and do that. We need to actually make sure that anybody who's in detention for immigration, purposes, they should be let out right now. It's unjust that they were there before COVID, but it is a death sentence now. And that is the responsibility of this country. There's nothing stopping that except the political will. People say, oh, we can't do that. It's easy. You open the damn door. It's really simple. Yeah.
So our final question to you is, what do you think artists should be doing right now?
Making great art. It's actually, it's like artists should be making art, and we should be we're part of society overall. We are, citizens of planet Earth, and we should be doing what we do, including, it's like we have to take care of our friends and family and community, and that's really important in its own right. But we need whoever the next artist is going to step up and do the next Guernica for this time. We need people to make the the artwork that is the equivalent of some of the the Mexican murals that happened in the 1930s that were telling the stories, or some of the Chinese dissonant art that happened, well, both the peasant painting but also the dissonant art in the 90s and aughties, that who's going to be the next Ai Weiwei? Who's going to actually tell the story? And it's like, I mean, the work, say, that he's done about some of the crisis of refugees and migrants, I mean, it's obviously complicated. Some people like some of that work, other people don't like it, but I think it's really great that one of the most prominent artists on the planet is doing that kind of work. Who's going to do that kind of work, talking about sort of the crisis that humanity faces now, where frankly most governments or many governments are failing people, including causing tremendous death and suffering, where people are starting to come together, and where the people that are vulnerable in a society like America are being put through the grinder, and the very powerful are enriching themselves off of this. Who's going to make art that enables people to know that story, as well as enables people to have the strength to resist in this moment and find the ways to do that?
Great. Well, I think we're going to open it up for questions now. Do people have any questions? Oh, here. Mark Grifton asked this question. What do you think of the word artivist? And can you tell us about your T-shirt?
The term artivist, I have been called an artivist, and by people I greatly admire and respect. I personally don't like the term all that much. I think that it's like I'm an artist and I'm an activist, but I don't. I mean, I just think that the art is the art. I mean, it's art. Was Diego Rivera an artivist? Was John Hendricks and Yoko Ono and those people who in the 60s were doing work, including demonstrations and art in museums to challenge the MoMA's policies against Vietnam, in Vietnam. I mean, it was very political, very socially engaged work, but it was art. And I mean, I think that we should not. I don't think we need a new term for what art that talks about the world is. That's just art. And hopefully it's good art.
Interesting.
And then my T-shirt is a T-shirt that we made at the bottom. I hope you can see it. It's a Slave Rebellion reenactment. I think that's what it says.
Yeah.
Slave Rebellion reenactment, November 8th and 9th, 2019. So it was just the shirt that people who participated in Slave Rebellion reenactment got, and I happened to just be wearing it because I like the shirt. So.
Anne and I are joking about making a T-shirt for our site that just says genius, because we think anybody who can survive social isolation or any of the other crises that are coming up in the world and still make art is a genius.
Yeah. Well, cool. So you should make that, and I can get one of those, and so then I don't have to worry about getting one of those MacArthur grants. So I could just get the middleman and get a shirt that says genius.
Yeah, yes. we would encourage.
We will make more than two.
Okay,
more than two. Are there any other questions? I see Terry asking. Dred kind of discussed what he's working on right now already.
Anybody else have a question?
Should we, if you don't feel like typing your question, we can also unmute you if you want to use the raise hand button. If you click on participants, you can click raise hand, and I can unmute you.
I was looking at the chat myself, and I see that there's a question: do I think art and business can work together? I think art and business do work together. Whether they should or shouldn't, I don't know. But, it's like at this, I mean, look, this is a time in which, we see many art publications when talking about, say, art fairs, which are overly significant in the arts discussion. But one of the first things it talks about is what's sold. And in a certain sense, who cares? I mean, it's like the box office report. This movie had more box office than that movie this weekend. Nobody says, is the movie any good or not? Nobody says, is the artwork any good or not that's sold at Art Basel or whatever. And I'm much more interested in those questions about aesthetics and ideas than commerce. But, it's like the commercial art world is, very significant in the arts at present. And, without certain, Slave Rebellion reenactment, it was not an all volunteer project. I mean, a lot of people put in a lot of time that wasn't as well financially compensated as I would have liked or they would have liked. But that took a lot of money, and most of it was, nonprofit donations, and there were a lot of individual contributions. But all of that ultimately came from people who had disproportionate wealth, and that was through business. Whether I like that or not, that's just a fact. And so art and business do work together. Hopefully it won't get to the point where if you want to make art, you have to, have a BMW branding on your painting or whatever branding on your prints. But art and business, they go together, and hopefully we can get to the point where they aren't as closely intertwined, and when people have the resources to make art and the capacity to exhibit it and capacity to have it talked about critically without worrying about how much it sold for or how valuable it is.
Thank you. I have a question from Christine. Dred, do you have thoughts regarding other members of the art community, and what can they do to support artists right now?
They all suck. No, I mean, it's like, it's like, look, the art community is a community. That's where my friends are mostly. I mean, I have friends outside of the art community, but it is actually community. And we're all sitting here gathered around plastic screens looking at each other because it is a community. I think people are doing a lot of really good things. Some of in fact, the costume designer the lead costume designer for Slave Rebellion reenactment, one of the first things they started doing during the COVID crisis was sewing, protective masks for people, and initially started giving them away both to EMS people and to hospital people, but other people who needed masks. And so that's very necessary, but it's also necessary to have curators curate conversations and shows like this. Again, I think this is really important because there's a lot of yak going on right now. The arts community, I mean, I'm on the board of the New York Foundation for the Arts, and I'm really proud that our director has, really jumped in and figured out how to get money to artists, because artists are often very precarious and vulnerable to economic shifts. And we're trying to do everything possible to get as much money, including from foundations, to make it available to artists so that people don't, lose their studios or lose their houses, and they can continue to eat and continue to make, continue to make work. I think that's really important. If you have extra money, buy some artist artwork. That's a good way to support an artist. If you have even more money, give it to arts organizations so they can support artists. Curators. Apparently, Barbara Polak needs money. I suspect that it takes time to put together an exhibition like this, and I suspect that you aren't getting paid for it because it's never going to be sold to a major institution. So, these are, look, some people in the arts have money, some people in the arts have a lot of money, and other people are living hand to mouth. That's what our community is. And I think that we should, look out for each other as best we can. I don't think I'm going to become homeless or lose my studio in this period, but I have friends that I worry about, and to the degree I can, I'm looking out for them. But we also, that one thing that it's like, I had a friend ask me, had I applied for, I forget the exact, there's a new sort of funding for artists who impacted by COVID. I forget which, artist relief, I think it is. It's really good. It's out there. There's, I think, a couple $100,000 that's being available for artists, which is great. And she said, have I applied? And I said, well, no, I haven't, because while I definitely am looking a little bit shaky at my economic future long term, I'm not as desperate as many artists, and I'm going to try and go for the Paycheck Protection Program that the federal government, set up. The irony is that since I am a self-employed artist with no employees, I don't actually really qualify I mean, if I had bought an airline company, the Paycheck Protection Program would have been great for me. If I had owned Shake Shack, that would have been great. But as an individual artist, a small businessman, they really don't care about us. And so the natural functioning of this system is actually crushing the actual small business people, which is what artists are. And they, it's like, and then there's the political dimension of they would love to shut people like us up and make us more dependent upon whatever they can do. So, there's a reason why the Koch brothers were, sort of investing in the Metropolitan Opera and things like that, so that the people who perhaps make some dissonant opera are more beholden to them and won't do that, or that they've invested in film, in public broadcasting, and so that they could actually choke off the channels that make people more dependent upon that. So the irony is that there are really good people in the arts doing a lot of good stuff, but the real money is the billions and billions of dollars that is going elsewhere. And while we, I think, need to really look out for each other and look out for our community and make sure it survives this pandemic, it is criminal that we're all paying taxes into that, and yet what's really happening is, cruise industries and airline companies and banks are lining their pockets.
Thank you. We have Janet asking, violence often generates political and social change. Does violence or the role of violence play a role in your work or thoughts?
Violence exists, and I think that the reason the people who run exploited and oppressive countries, including like this one, it rests upon violence. I mean, if the police weren't shooting and brutalizing people, then a lot of people wouldn't go along with the unjust things they're being made to do. I mean, and more practically, it's like at a time when people literally are facing eviction or facing starvation in both the United States but elsewhere. If there weren't violence of armies and cops to say, no, you couldn't go just take food that you need, people would go take food that they needed. And so violence is the foundation of exploitative societies. And then as far as social change, I mean, there have been revolutions that have happened in the past, and there have even been, change through violence. I mean, it's like the ending of chattel slavery in the United States was through the Civil War. It wasn't fought over moral reasons. It's not like the North decided the South is unjust and we're going to invade and overthrow the system of enslavement. That's not what happened. It was about sort of the North trying to keep the Union, as it were, together, and then enslaved people fought at great numbers to sacrifice to get free. And so, but it did actually take a war. And I think that was a really just war. And much the way I think that actual revolutions, I mean, while China is not a country that I would want to move to today, and there were actual real problems even through the 70s, if you compare China in 1948 to China in 1970, where life expectancy had doubled, where literacy had gone up drastically, where women had the right to divorce and had access to own property. There were many, many different things between those two societies, which again, it was not utopia. I don't think that it was, but I think that there were profound changes that happened because of that revolution. And I think other revolutions have been just and righteous. And I think that at bottom, exploitive societies rarely give up power without being overthrown. And so, in the final analysis, I think that if we're not actually talking about getting rid of an exploitive society, everything else is kind of BS. And so, but that's a longer conversation than what's the role of art. And so.
I think the next question is, can you share some of your thoughts on the role of technology in your work, and how would you recommend young artists step up during this time?
Well, I think we should have a broader view of technology. I mean, a paintbrush is actually technology. I don't do a lot of painting, but a paintbrush is technology. A printing press is technology. There's all kinds of technology. It's just that when we talk about tech now, we're often talking about, well, are you making work using Instagram, and perhaps if you're a dinosaur, using Photoshop and printing something out. And, it's like, I think artists have always used technology that's available to them. I mean, one of the, the Grand Jatte or whatever, that was really a pointillist painting that was when people understood how the human eye works and how things could be broken down into RGB, and that was kind of cool. And so, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy actually was looking at, what was in the Bauhaus, we're looking at what was the cutting edge technology of the day. The constructivists in the Soviet Union, they were looking at what was the cutting edge. I mean, everything was made out of steel because that was new. It was a new way to build. And so, artists have always used technology, and I think artists should use technology. But, it's also fine to go totally old school and, use really antiquated technology like a pencil on paper. That's cool too. The question is, what is the aesthetic and what are the ideas? And as far as advice for young people is, don't listen to old people like me, listen to young people who actually know something about the world. And because, it's like if what I had been thinking would have worked out, we would not be in the cesspool that we are in. Well, I hope that I'm contributing something to humanity, and I'm really fighting to. There is a point to don't trust anybody over 30 that I think is still relevant, and I'm way the hell over 30. And more than that, I mean, I do think I have something to offer, but as far as younger artists, in terms of aesthetics, I do think there is a real split between what I think of and what my generation thinks of as art and a way to make art, and generations that come after ours. And so, particularly, I mean, you can look at it with music. I mean, it's really hard to be innovative. There are very few musicians who, after their second or third or fourth album, are still cutting edge. I mean, it's like, the Rolling Stones may have been really kick-ass in 1966. I don't know if anybody's listening to their new music now. And, it's like, I really like, say Public Enemy, but they kind of ran up against some limitations and they aren't what's really cutting edge. I mean, there's the new generation of people like, I don't know, Kendrick Lamar has kicked them to the curb. And then after that, maybe it's Billie Eilish now. I don't know. But I'm an old guy, and the kind of art that I make uses dinosaur technology. And so I would say find out what young people are doing and find a way to do that.
All right, for the final question, can we unmute Elena Herzog?
Yeah, we have Elena Herzog. Where's Elena? We also have a raised question from Dieter, but hold on, where's Elena?
Yes.
Should we?
Are you going to ask my own question?
Okay.
Yeah, just ask your own question.
Can I read it? No. I was one of the things that I love about your Rebellion project is it's, this kind of like awareness enhancing experience. It's like so full of, content and educational content. And what I was thinking was that, it's that lack of, it's that incredibly profound repression of, the history of slavery in this country that, it's just so pervasive. It's like in our blood, we grow up being so well indoctrinated that, it's changing that. That's imperative. And it's, the fact of that is how the status quo kind of gets away with throwing, the people of color under the bus now in this crisis without people really understanding how embedded it is in, the way the society operates. And how do we apply, the kind of consciousness raising that a project like yours did about slavery and the history of slavery, at a rate that we need to do? I mean, there have been incredible books published, about these histories. How do we make social change by moving the needle now in this situation?
Well, I think part of the thing is, one of the things that I feel is important about, or felt was important about Slave Rebellion reenactment, is that it really shifted the conversation to one not just, I mean, it wasn't actually a project about slavery. It was a project about freedom and emancipation. And it really centered sort of enslaved people and the descendants of enslaved people as the agents for change. I mean, the most radical ideas about freedom and emancipation in the United States in 1811 were in the heads of enslaved people. These were people that were trying to seize all of Orleans territory, which is modern day Louisiana, and set up an African republic in the New World that would have outlawed slavery. It was a more radical idea than the so-called founding fathers who wrote the US Constitution, which their idea of democracy was predicated upon owning human beings. It was more radical than the French colonial society, which, had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and was actually a more radical bourgeois revolution than the US Revolution. But it was a slave empire. I mean, Haiti, Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, those were, Martinique, those were all slave islands that were producing sugar and coffee and tobacco to enrich France. And so the enslaved who said, well, no, we need a society that eliminates enslavement and we can do this. That was a radically different view of what society is, what democracy is, what the economy is, and who is going to bring that around. It's not like they said, let's form a super PAC and see if we can get the people that run America to kind of more enforce their rule. And maybe we'll only get whipped Monday through Friday, but not on Saturday and Sunday. That's not what they did. They said, we're going to, as ourselves, we're going to overthrow the system of enslavement. And that is a different perspective on how to look at how the period of slavery, but also what do the descendants of enslaved people, as well as other people, how did we look at that as who is going to change things? Are we, do we need to say, well, we need to rely on the best of sort of America to somehow get and think it will get to a just society? Or do we need to say, well, in 1811, the only way those people could get free was overthrowing the system of enslavement. The descendants of that legacy, regardless of their ethnicity, need to say, well, we actually need to get rid of a society that is based on exploitation and oppression. It was founded on slavery and genocide, and it is based on exploitation and oppression. Now, the question of how to do that is a different question, but I do think that the legacy of looking at this period and really centering the voices and ideas and action of enslaved people as the agents of change. Instead of studying what did George Washington write or what did Thomas Jefferson write, if you want to understand a radical view of the 19th century, look at what the enslaved were trying to do by getting free and study that history more. Study Toussaint Louverture, study the various other rebels, discover more about Nat Turner. Those were the people that were actually talking about getting free. And so I think that those kinds of people are the people we need to look to today, people who don't see the limitations of what is, but dream about what could be.
Thank you, Dred, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, keep following Art at a Time like this. Yeah. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.